in page 96, they blah, blah, blah. This, I'm going to really need to be lockstep with you in the notes.
Okay.
Because I don't think, I could probably open the book and find like, oh, he says something cool. Like when he's quoting quoting Jacques Monod and Edgar Morin, and he's making fun of them for their idealization of DNA, right? When I think it's Morin who says DNA, it's Adonai, right? Which is one of the names.
Yeah.
The Hebrew name, the Lord.
Oh, see, I didn't know what that was referring to.
There's a billion names for Yahweh or whatever.
Yeah.
But Adonai is a way of saying Yahweh without saying Yahweh, because you're not supposed to say Yahweh, even though I just did a billion times.
Which is,
I can do it. I can do it. I'm an atheist. So
no, that's actually an interesting point relative to the Bonfire, the Vanities. I mean, that shit plays. That plays into this, right? Because there was, I can't remember if it's later on in I feel like somewhere he mentions this prohibition against the image, which I think the same logic applies, because once you do that, what is the old thing too about the Aboriginal? I don't even know if it's kind of an apocryphal statement that there's some group that thought that if your photograph was taken, it would steal your
apparently
soul.
This was a superstition among the Native Americans, at least some tribes, maybe the Cherokee or something like that. This superstition that the realism of the photograph stole your soul, because it was right. It took your reflection. And so you could see this even in the myths about the vampires not seeing their reflection, right?
Oh,
they don't have a soul. That's very Baudrillardian.
Yeah.
That's an awful word. But it's interesting that Yahweh is the unpronounceable name, or at least the name you're not supposed to pronounce in Judaism, whereas in Islam,
I am that I am.
Yeah, in Islam, you're not supposed to pictorially represent Muhammad. Christians just are like, whatever, put my body on a cross and wear it around your neck, which is so fucking funny.
Well, eventually, yes. But I remember, I got to look up the Bonfire.
There was probably some heresies related to symbolism. Well, it's interesting, right? Because one of the breaks that Luther has with Catholicism is the almost pagan, excessive iconography in the Catholic Church, right? And so part of Protestantism is, if you're going to wear a cross around your neck, don't have a little man on it, which that's just kind of another stage in the evolution of the sign, as Baudrillard would say. Fuck, I'm feeling so Baudrillardian today.
Listen to this. A bonfire of the Vanities is a burning of objects condemned by religious authorities as occasions of sin. The phrase usually refers to the bonfire of 7 February 1497, when supporters of the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola collected and burned thousands of objects such as cosmetics, art, and books in Florence on the Shrove Tuesday festival.
That's kind of cool. Well, so it would tie back to what we kind of
exactly.
talked about with Bataille and Mouse, except now instead of it being useless expenditure, sacrifice, it's got an interesting tie-in with religion and censorship and that kind of thing.
The very rules of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is podcast. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Thank you for joining us on Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. I was thinking we might need a new sponsor, the Union of Pataphysicists. We'll see if they return my email. But before Taylor and I get started with our discussion today, just want to mention that we do have a Patreon account, patreon.com/MUHH. Consider throwing us a buck to help support the pod. We still lose money making the podcast.
Lisa, can I have some more?
Today, Taylor and I are going to look at Chapter 2 of Baudrillard's Symbolic Exchange in Death. Today, that focus will be on the Order of Simulacra. And earlier in the week, Taylor, you had mentioned that you had some frustration with the text, which I think you had said as well before we recorded the first episode. So I just wanted to kind of maybe start there and kind of see what your. This is funny too, because it's like we're on sort of two sides of this mirror thing, like in the sense of like your experience with this book and mine with Anti-Oedipus.
Yes, you've read this book before. I haven't. I've read Anti-Oedipus before, and you haven't. Even though Anti-Oedipus also frustrates me, but in a kind of in a different way.
Yeah,
not unrelated, but I think that when I read Baudrillard, as I tweeted out in all caps, what does he mean when he says words? That's part of his style, though. I mean, I've read, now this is probably the fifth book of his I've read, and I know he has a billion, and they're all like 10 pages long, except for this one, and a couple of. I'm just kidding. I guess that I feel he doesn't bother with. Sometimes he makes a pass at pinning down definitions that then don't really seem to be grounded in much. And that's okay. I mean, like, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of like when we read Libidinal Economy. I mean, Lyotard, you couldn't necessarily pin him down.
Yeah.
And I think that he makes a show of doing that. I don't think Baudrillard's showcasing it and foregrounding it like Lyotard does stylistically. I think that's just his manner of moving forward and doing his kind of sign analysis stuff. I just think that that's not what he's concerned with. Maybe as we get further in the text, we'll start to see. I know that the big chapter on death is coming up, and that's probably the biggest one in the book. Maybe, I mean, like, at the beginning of this chapter, he tries to set up, okay, you have the Renaissance and counterfeit production or counterfeit signs. You have the Industrial Revolution and production of signs, and then you have full-blown simulation. And it's like, okay, so that's the working definitions, but he kind of begs the question a little bit, or doesn't necessarily prove that. He just kind of assumes it, and assumes that we as readers will just kind of follow along with that. And I think that, it kind of reminds me of what Foucault's doing in The Order of Things, when he discusses, these different forms of analogy or different forms of representation, right? He talks about resemblance and similarity and blah, blah, blah. I think that when it clicked for me, and I'll let you respond after this. I think what it clicked for me is that I don't necessarily agree with Baudrillard that these are successive stages and like they're bygone eras, like the counterfeit somehow bygone. I feel like there's at least some sort of co-presence,
right?
I think there's some sort of simultaneity that he's just not concerned with discussing. So right. I think there's a diachronic trajectory that he's not necessarily focusing on. But once I started to think about it, the fact that not everything is simulation and full blown, that there are these other orders that are either subtending it or co-present. I think once I started thinking through his logic like that, I was more comfortable. So.
Yeah.
I hope, does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, he does mention that each successive procession of the simulacra subsumes the prior one.
Okay, that's a good point. That's a good point. So I'm not necessarily reading him against himself. I'm just emphasizing it.
By that, I don't know that he necessarily would be arguing that there aren't, I guess, vestigial traces of the other forms within, but the movement is sort of, I don't know. Yeah, it does kind of seem like a sort of linear.
But you are right to say that each preceding order requires that next level order to subsume it and explain it.
Yeah.
Or to render it subordinate. It's hard to say. Maybe as we keep going, we'll find the language to describe that movement. Because he does say something where I'm not sure if I agree with him or not. I'm just saying I'm not sure. Where he's like, "Oh, do you think the primitives simulated, or there was simulation for the primitives?" Do you know what I'm talking about? Where
yes. Actually, one of the first things I wanted to talk about, honestly, was that because I was super, given the context of Mouse and as well as a libidinal economy, I thought that was a pretty interesting place to start. Maybe.
Cool. Because
it almost seems like, yes, Even looking back at the mouse, it seems like the simulation is the potlatch is the symbolic. So it is in a sort of virtual simulacra of conflict, of
right?
Like armed conflict.
Yeah, this gets back to something that you've been pushing very, I won't say doggedly, but you've been pursuing this tactically, which is this notion about the sort of virtual continuation. The potlatch and the search for prestige and all of this being this virtual continuation of, or a simulation of combat and conflict, yes. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
That would be the thing where it'd be like, would Baudrillard say like, no, you misunderstand mouse, or no, you misunderstand me, by inserting simulation in back to the quote unquote primitives. And I don't know, right? Because I mean, the way that Deleuze takes up simulacra with Platonism, right, which is about overturning the model and the copy, which uses totally different language and philosophical concepts than Baudrillard. Plato is already concerned with how the simulacrum can threaten the idea, which is like the foundation, right, of his philosophy. Anyway, right. You take the reins, my friend, and I'm along for the ride.
I couldn't quite think of a good enough example with a quote unquote primitive society, but I was thinking back. Actually, this is young Agamben had mentioned this. He might have even mentioned this on one of the Wicked Leotard episodes about how, or maybe in discussions about how the Romans via gladiatorial games were already simulating. I don't know if you can quite, well, the Romans weren't doing commodity production in the same, at least not in the same manner as we are today, right?
No, definitely not. But I see you have actually a quote from Anti-Oedipus pulled up.
Yeah, last time we were reading through chapter, I guess the middle portion of Anti-Oedipus.
It's the conjunctive synthesis part.
Came across this little bit about simulation that I thought seemed to really kind of coincide with a little bit of what, because I think here they sort of are acknowledging, there is this break from the real.
Yeah, reality has ceased to be a principle. That sounds very much like what Baudrillard says, right? He says something very similar in the chapter we've read.
It is true that reality has ceased to be a principle. According to such a principle, the reality of the real was posed as a divisible abstract quantity, whereas the real was divided up into qualified unities, into distinct qualitative forms. But now the real is a product that envelops the distances within intensive quantities. The indivisible is enveloped and signifies what envelops it, does not divide without changing its nature or form. The schizo has no principles. He is something only being something else. He is manhood only by being worm, and worm only by being Jones. He is a girl only by being an old man who is miming or simulating the girl, or rather by being someone who is simulating an old man simulating a girl, or rather by simulating someone, etc. This was already true of the completely oriental art of the Roman emperors, the 12 paranoiacs of Suetonius. In a great book by Jacques Bess, we encounter once again the double stroll of the schizo, geographic exterior voyage, following non-decomposable distances, and the interior historical voyage enveloping intensities. Christopher Columbus calms his mutinous crew and becomes an admiral again only by simulating a false admiral who is simulating a whore who is dancing.
It's page 87 of Anti-Oedipus. Yeah, that's a very interesting quote. And so it's interesting to note that the emphasis that Deleuze and Guattari are putting on the notion of simulation, not to bring up what I was talking about earlier with overturning Platonism, which is related, but here at least simulation is about the non-segregative use of the conjunctive synthesis, which, to say it without sounding like a fucking nerd so much, it's about this fact that the quote unquote subject who we presume ourselves to be is this fiction that is kind of subtended by all these other, a better way to say it, a good example is when Jean-Paul Sartre describes the waiter at the cafe who is almost too attentive, who is trying to be the waiter when in reality he can't be the waiter. He can only act the part of the waiter. And it's like, because he's overly attentive and overly emphasizing and trying to be play this part, or trying to be the part instead of play it. and instead of simulating it, that there's something off-putting about him. I think that that's part of what's involved is like when we say, oh, of course, that's what I wanted. I wanted to kill my father. I wanted to kill my mother. That idea that we are the part in this representational theater of the unconscious. We are Oedipus or whatever. That's when we fall into the paralogism, right, of the third synthesis. That's when we kind of fall into this segregative use. And that's when, too, we fall into a kind of fascistizing, oh, well, of course I belong to the chosen race for all time. That kind of feeling of belonging to a superior group, that's where they see Oedipus and the downfall of that third synthesis, that way of perceiving ourselves as a stable subject that is somehow superior. That's why they turn to Artaud and Rimbaud, his poetry about being a beast, being a Negro, being of an inferior race for all time, for all eternity. I think that they quote that at least 3 or 4 times in the first 100 pages. They're really trying to emphasize this notion about the dangers of feeling oneself to be somehow superior to others.
I think you can kind of see too, like the direct influence that Anti-Oedipus has here, and maybe this very passage that, although I think Baudrillard's got this, maybe some of the Society of the Spectacle shit would also perhaps be related or like be the inspiration for what he's doing. I mean, it's a direct inspiration.
I would think the Society of the Spectacle would be. See, I don't know the reception of the text in France broadly. I know more about like Anti-Oedipus's reception, but I assume Society of the Spectacle and the Situationists had some influence. And what Society of the Spectacle, didn't that come out in 1967? It's technically pre-68, but it would probably influence some of the discussions afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, definitely a lot of overlap as far as what it says with at least this specific simulacra element of what Baudrillard is discussing.
For listeners out there who don't really like Hegel, but like French theorists, I would look at Society of the Spectacle, look at how Debord manipulates kind of rhetorically the different ideas he puts forth. It is actually very Hegelian, but it's kind of fun. It's like fun Hegelianism, cute Hegel art.
Since we are talking about situationists, and I just want to mention really briefly, this is sort of skipping ahead, but I just want to make sure that I mention this because within the chapter, he does reference this sort of, he kind of lauds, I guess you would say, graffiti artists.
Yes.
Early taggers within New York City that would tag the subway trains, etc., right? And the sort of radical potential of what this is doing. And this gets very much into like the Lefebvre influence as well in terms of the urban geography, but détournement also, it is, you know what I mean?
I remember the first piece of Baudrillard I ever read, and I didn't know this until I reread this chapter, was probably the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism. I'm trying to remember where I read it, but it was this excerpt about graffiti. Maybe Baudrillard actually talks about graffiti again in some of his other books. He might recycle like Zizek.
Yeah, I'm sure he does.
But yeah, this was a very interesting, complicated analysis because he's doing two things at once, right? Where he's kind of saying, well, I guess he was contrasting graffiti exporting the ghetto throughout the white suburban areas versus, where was it? Is it Germany? Is it Switzerland that he was talking about? It was the Dutch, right? And in the Netherlands, they had like a wall that was dedicated for, on this wall, you could tag graffiti, paint whatever you want, but on the other walls, you're arrested if you go outside that one designated. And I guess his point being like, this is kind of another way to try to, to police this uncontrollable movement of taking back the space, right? And decoding the signs throughout. I'm mixing terminologies here, but I'm going to do that with.
I was going to say that I was thinking too, like the coding of the disrupting. It's like a guerrilla disrupting of the code of capitalism. Because I think maybe that's the way, and maybe you could fill in on this too. Because I get the feeling that when it comes to coding or code, that Deleuze and Guattari and Baudrillard have opposite notions of that. Because for Deleuze and Guattari, it's the decoded flows, But for Baudrillard, it's capitalism encodes the real.
Yeah.
It encodes the real and produces these layers of simulacra, or these different forms of simulacra that evolve in this kind of linear fashion, subsuming the prior order within.
Right. I think that he sees code as, in a certain way, the apotheosis, the highest form of the sort of structuralist oppositional understanding of the sign, right? A sign is only a sign in its difference, opposition to other signs. That moment of which he kind of begins, I think in chapter 1, he discusses a little bit about Saussure, right?
He does.
So I see that as kind of like the taking that logic and ensconcing it. Whereas for Deleuze and Guattari, as you said, their way of understanding the stages in the development of the state leading to capitalism, with the primitive territorial machine, its main goal is to code, right? And we see some of that with Mauss, right? Within this notion of all the different forms of exchange and potlatch or whatever presupposes, in order to function at all, that the signs are already encoded, right? That the bracelets and necklaces and yada, 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 that lead to prestige and that incur a debt to be repaid, that has to presuppose a code of some sort of quote unquote value, a marking, if you will, is what they
inscription.
Say. Yeah, you could say that. There's different ways of saying it. And for them, capitalism, because of the sort of abstract equivalent of money, its movement is the decoding of flows, which almost everything with Deleuze and Guattari has positive and negative benefits. The question would be, I think at a certain level, you can't necessarily oppose Deleuze and Guattari and Baudrillard on code, because I think that it presupposes, to do that, one would have to make various translations and fill in various conceptual lapses, if you will, or just deviations in order to get them on the same plane. I just think they're working within their own terminological frameworks. And so it's interesting to just think about how they both focus on code. Even in A Thousand Plateaus, code comes back up and becomes very important for understanding refrains and territories and these other things. So like the concepts for each live totally different lives and sketch out different planes of consistency.
If I'm doing this correctly, that Deleuze and Guattari would be in the camp of Lyotard, in that primitive societies are already simulating.
That's very possible. I mean, like, this is something
you said, I'm saying that because you had said, okay, so they assume these things are already coded.
Yes.
The necklaces, the items that are being exchanged within the potlatch are already encoded. That's in the very rigid structure of the gift economy, right? So in that sense, in that context, the decoded flows. So what capitalism is doing is decoding those social symbolic almost. I can kind of think of it in this terms of the symbolic order. It gets upended under capitalism, and those are freed, and it's breaking down those sort of cultural, I don't know, maybe you would say phyla or like milieu or something like that.
Yeah, I think this
strata,
is actually,
I don't know if stratas. I would say phyla is probably more what I was thinking of. But
this is where perhaps Deleuze and Guattari would say, if I'm trying to understand this right, that when I said last time, I probably said this a million times, but I'll say it again, what Deleuze and Guattari kind of say, that capitalism haunts primitive territorial machine as like it's negative, right? It's this haunting shadow. And what the primitive territorial machine fears is the decoding of flows. And perhaps then that is like Plato fearing the simulacra and the wild becomings that it implies. And therefore, maybe Deleuze and Guattari would agree with Baudrillard and say what primitive societies are trying to ward off, in fact, is the simulation inherent in capitalistic systems.
Oh, that's good. That's very good. Yeah,
so I'm kind of devil's advocating a little bit, but yeah. So that's where maybe Deleuze and Guattari and Baudrillard could actually be aligned a little bit, even despite the terminological differences. Yeah. I think that perhaps then and do you have the quote? We should look at Baudrillard's quote, which we alluded to just a few minutes ago about Baudrillard asking this almost rhetorical question, like, do you think the primitive societies were simulating? If you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Here's the quote. The question-answer circularity runs through every domain. We are slowly beginning to notice that the whole domain of surveys, polls, and statistics must be revised according to the radical suspicion brought to bear on their methods. The same suspicion bears, however, on ethnology. Unless you admit that the natives are totally natural and incapable of simulation, then the problem is the same with the above as it is here. It is impossible to obtain a non-simulated response to a direct question apart from merely reproducing the question. It is not even certain that we can test plants, animals, or inert matter in the exact sciences with any hope of.
With any hope of an objective response?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. You're right.
No, you're good. That's probably, now I'm rethinking. I mean, unless you admit that the natives are totally, quote unquote, natural and incapable of simulation, it's almost as though he leaves it an open question. I think that I misremembered him saying, of course they can't. But now he's kind of saying it itself is begging the question by calling them, quote unquote, natural. And he does admit that in that first regime that he's looking at with the Renaissance and counterfeit, when he says the modern sign then finds its value as the simulacrum of a quote unquote nature. So I don't know, but I stick with what I kind of said to you earlier about how if simulation is already there from the start in all things human, or at least in the Lacanian sense of there being a symbolic universe that precedes us and in which we are born into, or at least in which we kind of emerge through castration, blah, blah, blah. Then, of course, idealizing the natives as natural, quote unquote, perhaps in a base level Rousseauism, right, with the noble savage and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Unless we fall into that error, that ethnographic kind of prejudice, I think is what Baudrillard would say. And Maus too was trying to fight some of the ethnographic, the ethnocentric notions that get imported into our conceptions. And yeah, unless we reproduce a Rousseau about some sort of origin that we could go back to.
I mean, the first simulation is the name of God.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Okay, if you're taking the position of the atheist or even agnostic, let's say, just maybe in the context of Christianity, mm-hmm. because that's the first thing that has no origin in the real. One of the examples of simulacra is that something like an angel, right? Okay, there is no real angel. There are only simulations of the whatever the signifier of angel. Right. But there's never a real referent to an actual angel.
It's kind of like the notion of mana that we saw with Maus, and
right.
Lévi-Strauss comes back up brings it up as the empty sign, which means actually that it can kind of take on any value rather than that it has no value at all. And Lyotard deals with this question through the notion of zero that we've discussed many times. I would say, if I had a big brain Humean moment, that like angel and the way that you're talking about it in terms of its simulation is kind of like miracles. Spinoza is basically the same thing as Hume on this, which is basically that there are no miracles. Miracles are a stand-in for our lack of causal explanation for something that's potentially scientifically explainable with enough advance in understanding. Does that make sense? Miracles are really the simulations of our ignorance.
Right, yeah. No, I mean, that's kind of what I was thinking too. Mm-hmm. It is interesting too to bring up Spinoza, that he does mention Leibniz. Yeah. And Leibniz is God. And there's a few references to that here within the chapter that I thought were really interesting, even though they weren't the biggest points but I feel like super interesting points for discussion.
What's one of the things he says? I'm looking up in the index 80 page.
The 80. Mathematically minded Leibniz saw in the mystical elegance of the binary system where only the 0 and the 1 count, mm-hmm. the very image of creation, the unity of the supreme being operating by a means of a binary function against the nothing was sufficient ground, he thought, from which all things could be made. Actually, that's a Marshall McLuhan quote.
Okay.
That's Baudrillard quoting McLuhan.
And that makes perfect sense, especially with...
Oh, this next part's really good too.
Sure, yeah.
Digitality is its metaphysical principle. Leibniz, God, and DNA, its prophet. In fact, it is in the genetic code that the genesis of simulacra today finds its completed form. At the limits of an ever more forceful extermination of references and finalities, of a loss of semblances and designators, we find the digital programmatic sign, which has a purely tactical value. at the intersection of other signs, bits of information, or tests, and which has the structure of a micromolecular code of command and control.
And this is around the same part when he's talking about the quote unquote biology philosophers, Jacques Monod and Edgar Morin, which I brought up at the very start, when DNA equals Adonai, right?
Yeah.
The phantasm of the code, which is the equivalent to the reality of power, is confused with the idealism of the molecule. We'll see Deleuze and Guattari discuss Jacques Monod in Capitalism and Schizophrenia as well. But yes, it makes sense that McLuhan would say something like this about Leibniz and the binary, code, especially with the rise of cybernetics, with the rise of, information systems, computers. All that logic is very familiar to us, to we modern humans.
But yeah, I was thinking God is the first simulation.
He brings up God, and let me find the passage. I don't know if you have the text. I see it on page 75. This is about the automaton and the robot. And
I found this one with Leibniz and his binary deity as their precursor. The technocrats of the biological as well as the linguistic sciences opt for the genetic code. For the intended program has nothing to do with genetics, but is a social and historical program. Biochemistry hypostatizes the ideal of a social order governed by a kind of genetic
code.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think he is discussing the second order simulacrum simplifies the problem by the absorption of appearances or by the liquidation of the real, whichever you prefer, ... No more semblance or dissemblance, no more God or man, only an immanent logic of the principle of operativity.
Which is a banger quote, I thought.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And this is when he's talking about the Baroque and the use of stucco in order to kind of simulate nature. So this is still the second order simulacrum, if I understand correctly, is the order of counterfeit, or is first order counterfeit? And then
first order is counterfeit.
Okay, so first order is counterfeit, and then second order would be production.
Right. And then now simulation. Simulation is 3.
Now, would first order still be the Baroque, since it's the use of stucco to like simulate nature? Is he still understanding that as counterfeit?
That's how I read it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how I read it.
Because I would say this gets back to my trying to grapple with him, where saying that obviously the logic of the first order would still have a kind of functionality in the second order. And that's why you corrected me by saying, yes, the second order still subsumes the first order. And so
I think it
doesn't eliminate it. Maybe it doesn't eliminate it.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that operates very similar to think of it as strata.
Yeah.
Strata and phyla effectively from the Deleuze-Guattarian kind of model, perhaps, would be a way to, these are layers of sediment that are poured on top of one another. So yes, stuff can still emanate from a certain stratum up the phyla, but as you as those layers become more and more, then that gets attenuated, I think, is the way to kind of think of Baudrillard. Those resonances, those signals from the preceding level of strata are going to have a harder time going through the flows of signs and desire, etc., that are subsuming the original.
I think it's interesting that counterfeit is the way I guess I'm seeing it is on the first level of counterfeit, you have this mirror of art and nature, right? And art is trying to reproduce, imitate life, imitate nature. So you have this mirror effect. Whereas, and so you're simulating nature. And then on the second level, I suppose that the binary perhaps switches and art is for art's sake, right? Or that art is simulating with the production of signs, I guess it takes on either a technological model, right? Where it's about machines now that
right.
But I suppose then that the third order of simulation, the simulacra, doesn't resemble anything. It's not imitating anything. Is that the point, I think?
Yeah, I think so. Which is kind of interesting too, because he says, he does talk about art. He talks about Warhol and, Warhol in it famously with the factory, right? That seems to be more in line with the second order of
that makes sense.
But you know what I mean? That's kind of problematizes his whole distinct thing, unless you're granting me that the layers or the orders simply attenuate the farther you get from the first order, it attenuates its ability to proliferate in a sense, but it doesn't necessarily eliminate fully.
Yeah, it's kind of Hegelian alphabung, kind of
which
dialectical. It's raised up, but also canceled out, but not eliminated.
Yeah,
right? Just, we don't really have a good word in English for it. I know that I've talked to some friends online about this, but the notion one of the translations we have of alphabung is sublation, and that word just doesn't really mean anything except about carrying, etymologically carrying under. In any case, I think that you're right about the Warhol cans. It's interesting that it would straddle the second and third order, because the Warhol, I'm thinking of the Campbell soup cans. One of the things he's famous for, the paintings of I
think he specifically mentions the Marilyn Monroe here.
But that's a similar. Yeah. I mean, it's a similar procedure, right?
Yeah, exactly. Except, I guess, would you say that Campbell soup has an original?
It's interesting, right? Wouldn't Campbell soup be on as a sign with a kind of logo for a corporation? Wouldn't that just be a second order?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But Warhol, by changing, by reproducing it endlessly like a series, and Baudrillard does talk about seriality.
Yes, he talks a lot about it. Yeah.
There's a way of denaturing it even further than its quote unquote natural image. And there's something it by sheer repetition, it destroys any logic of imitating an original. Good. But this is where Deleuze, I think, is actually close to Baudrillard, even if they're
difference in repetition for real men. That came up in my mind several times.
Yeah,
especially in the discussion of the serial. But I'll let you go.
Yeah. This is why I pointed you to the appendix of Logic of Sense, where Deleuze is tackling Platonism and the question of overturning the copy model conceptual image of thought, if you will. So with Plato, right? If my hammer breaks, I don't look. When I make another hammer, I don't look to the hammer I have in front of me. I look to the ideal hammer in the heavens of ideas, the quote unquote original, the model for the ideal hammer. And I make the real hammer based off that ideal hammer. But, what Deleuze is trying to sort of argue is that this is perhaps suitable for a certain type of thinking. Mm-hmm. Just as Euclidean geometry was suitable for a certain type of conceptualization of space-time. But it's only when we advance and continue to problematize and create new problems and ask different questions that it becomes necessary to suspend the postulate of, parallel lines never meeting in infinity. And said the same way with Platonism, doesn't allow one to, or tries to outlaw certain conceptualizations of becoming, of wild becoming. Socrates asks, is there an idea even for the tiniest things like hair and mud, these things that seemingly aren't important enough to merit an idea to themselves. And so, Plato is trying to put a stop to wild simulation, right? Overtaking everything, which would overturn the very model of the ideas as a model.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think Baudrillard and Deleuze are actually very close here. Again, even though they're talking in different registers and they're focusing on different objects.
Interesting note here too, just that in the actual book, the more famous Simulacra and Simulation, one of the early, I think maybe even the first chapter discusses the map that exceeds the territory. Like
very
I forget the kingdom where they want to have a very accurate map of the kingdom. It eventually becomes so detailed that it's impossible to tell where the map starts and the territory ends and vice versa. This
is based on a Borges story, right? Because Lyotard discusses,
I'm sure I've got Simulation and Simulacra. I could just go grab it.
It's possibly Lyotard who discusses this example very quickly. The kingdom falls apart before they can even finish the map because it becomes more and more infinitesimally detailed. But yes, you're right about this. The map.
Yeah, it is Borges. If we were
okay, yeah, good.
If we're able to view the Borges fable in which the cartographers of the empire draw a map so detailed that it ends up covering the territory exactly, the decline of the empire witnesses the fraying of this map little by little, and it falls into ruins. Though some shreds are still discernible in the deserts, the metaphysical beauty of this ruin abstraction testifying to a pride equal to the empire and rotting like a carcass, returning to the substance of the soil, a bit as the double ends being confused by the real through aging. As the most beautiful allegory of simulation, this fable has now come full circle for us and possesses nothing but the discreet charm of second-order simulacra.
There you go. I do think that Lyotard mentions this very briefly.
Hold on to my earlier point about how the strata can still get attenuates, but they don't, or they get sublimated or incorporated, but they don't disappear fully. It is the real and not the map whose vestiges persist here and there in the deserts that are no longer those of the empire, but ours, the desert of the real itself. And that's page 1 of Simulation and Simulacra.
It's interesting about the desert of the real, which is a phrase we re-encounter in the Matrix movies, right?
Yes, correct. Simulation and Simulacra is the book that Neo hides his discs in.
I mean, this is why we started our first episode on this book being like, all right, let's get the Matrix shit out of the way.
Which is funny because it is and it isn't in the Hegelian sense. Like it is and it isn't a good example or a good metaphor.
Yeah. I mean, it's, but it's good because it's a popular cultural icon that most people, will be familiar with. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari, when they talk about the nomad or the schizophrenic retreating into the desert, they describe the desert in this sense as the body without organs, sort of retreating to that the sort of non-codable flow, right? That which resists the machines and repels them, blah, blah, blah. And in that sense, I think the desert of the real could very much easily tie in with Deleuze and Guattari's discussion of the desert.
I feel like this is something that Zizek also riffs on.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, he does.
I was going to say as well that lost my train of thought.
I blame Zizek.
Damn it. I forget what it was. What I still understand in the book itself, and he mentioned this in chapter 1 a lot, was the structural law of value. I still don't exactly understand what the fuck he's talking about. It's
structuralism like we discussed. It's the Saussurean understanding of the oppositionality, right? So even 0-1 is just the binary understanding of signs only have value in their difference from other signs, right, in the system.
Yeah.
So that's how I understand his.
Now, in that sense, you would say too, if you're using that model, then I don't see how you can avoid saying that primitive societies could simulate. Because language has persisted throughout all of the procession of simulacra. It is itself its own form of simulation, right? It's trying to simulate objects in the world, at least from the layman's point of view, right? The logic of it is to represent.
Right.
Whether it does or not, that's obviously we can problematize that. That's been problematized. But.
Yeah, I think that the only thing that maybe complicates this would be, because it seems like Baudrillard's getting to the structural stage after this impasse between use and exchange value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, which I think kind of coincides too, because he does mention this sort of coinciding with man becoming becoming a machine in the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
Because if you think about it, at that point, their commodity production, or maybe not commodity production, let's say consumerism in the way that we envisage it now versus the way that it occurred during the Industrial Revolution are quite different, right? Now it is about consumption has superseded production as the dominant social relation for Baudrillard. And he even talks about this as well in the context of caste society, which weirdly he says that different castes that fashion doesn't exist within caste society.
Right.
Because there's no mobility.
Yes.
Which is interesting because in our current world, right, what's interesting about fashion is that it can elide or it can lubricate how one signifies, or you can be a false signification of wealth or whatever by having the signs of X.
We've all seen the memes with the guy wearing t-shirt, jeans, and shoes and sunglasses, and then you have their fucking Gucci sunglasses that cost $600, right? They're literally quote unquote high fashion. He looks like a normal schlub, but his white t-shirt made by Kanye West is like $400. Something like that, right?
But that is collapsing the differential between the prior orders, where I'm sure the kings and whatnot, right? They would have the purple, it is kind of a weird, like, yes and no dialectic to the certain fashion, because I believe, right, you might even know the Indian, like the Untouchables, the caste.
Oh, you're talking about the Hindus. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the Untouchables, they're almost, you can either think of them outside of the caste system or at the very base of the pyramid, if you want to think of it that way. Because
it feels like there would be
their
jobs. Right. But wouldn't there be like a certain dress?
I guess that would be the thing. Obviously, Baudrillard is using fashion in a very specific sense, because we know that in a general sense, fashion changes across cultures, across times, whatever. But he's using it in this sense of a logic of the sign. And so if you think about what he's saying, then, because there's all kinds of stories, especially folk tales about, little country boy who, he wouldn't necessarily change his fashion by dressing up as a king. It would be counterfeiting. The logic of that older time period would be that of dissembling. Whereas I think now he's saying dissemblance and similarity are all a part of the code now. So does that make sense? So that one, it's not like the country laborer who dresses up as a king or a prince or whatever in order to get the girl to marry him or whatever. It's no longer like, oh, he changed his fashion, he changed his style. He's literally trying to dissemble, right? He's literally counterfeiting. He's into disguise, if you will.
Ooh, I have something interesting.
Go ahead.
The idea popped in my head. So it seems to be doing is there's a logic. What fashion does is allow there to be simulation of social movement, of rising and falling within the class structure. One can take on the signs, especially with credit, with the advent of credit and the proliferation of credit, the potential to poor person to acquire the signs of wealth is made possible. And in that sense, it gives the appearance, the screen appearance, if you will, that there is a type of social mobility involved, not only on that side of the wealth disparity, but on the opposite side as well, in that, like that example you gave about the person seemingly wearing normal, regular clothes, but the prices of those objects are quite high in comparison to like
extraordinary
in contrast to what the average person would spend on jeans, etc. You can think about, distressed clothing, etc., that is trying to give this simulation of like, you know what I mean? That's even a good example too, like the simulation of where, right, that so it's trying to collapse these class distinctions, but only merely at the by appearance, the gaze, the hyperreal gaze,
right,
that is simulating this notion of class mobility that really that has no referent. And that is a way for the simulation to prevent the libidinal band from overheating in a sort of similar tactic as potlatch. Because the capitalism can say, okay, here's the gift of, here are these signs. Now you can look here, you can have the outward appearance of wealth, even though you're not really wealthy. So that sort of pacifies this class antagonism, and it's able to attenuate class distinctions in a certain sense, even though not perfectly, right? It's not a totalizing thing, but the overall logic and movement of that, I think, is somewhat right. You see this too, and this extends to vehicles. The Chrysler 300 is one I'm thinking of, that is basically a knockoff aesthetic of the Rolls Royce, right?
Yeah.
The famous grille of the Rolls Royce is sort of being mimicked in the Chrysler 300. So one can take on the signs of wealth without necessarily being wealth. Obviously, that credit is another thing that I can't remember if he gets into that later or not, but just something I want to throw a pin in just to highlight that for the audience.
This is good. And I have a quote to piggyback off of what you were just saying and boost it. Well, it's on page 81 of the book, but he says, in its infinite reproduction, the system puts an end to the myth of its origin and to all the referential values it has itself secreted in the course of its process. By putting an end to the myth of its origin, it puts an end to its internal contradictions. There is no longer a real or a referential to which to oppose them, and also puts an end to the myth of its end, the revolution itself. With the revolution, you could still make out the outline of a victorious human and generic reference the original potential of man. But what if capital wiped generic man himself off the map in favor of genetic man? The revolution's golden age was the age of capital, where myths of the origin and the end were still in circulation. Once these myths were short-circuited, the only threat that capital had ever faced historically came from this mythical demand for rationality, which created it from the start. In a de facto operationality, a non-discursive operationality. Once it became its own myth, or rather an indeterminate aleatory machine, something like a social genetic code, capital no longer felt the slightest opportunity for a determinate reversal. This is the real violence of capital. However, it remains to be seen whether this operationality is itself a myth, whether DNA is itself a myth.
That's a banger quote. I had pulled that one as well, so I'm glad you.
Well, one of the things, just to start backwards, I guess, with DNA itself being a myth, it's obviously interesting that DNA was, and this is why he's quoting Jacques Monod, who's writing about chance and necessity in relation to the discovery of DNA, which would have been something that by that time, would have been at the most 20 years old by the time of this publication. This notion about, and I think this gets us back to this question of the structural law of value and these other things.
Yeah, definitely.
But we see so much the use of like 23andMe and Ancestry.com and all this stuff, this resurgence of a genealogical fascination with genetics and with tracing ancestry and these other things. Part of it gets tied up with a logic of eugenics, of
race science,
with right? A logic with it's putting a new coat of paint on 18th and 19th century race sciences. Yeah, I think so.
Elizabeth Warren, right, is a great example of that.
Oh my God, yeah,
right. The Pocahontas, like the whole. We don't have to go into that, but people.
No. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense to do that.
In that sense, yes, it's this origin that you're trying to find doesn't exist, right?
Right.
It's made up, right? It's its own, the idea of a race or whatever, like it's its own, it's just a signifier, right? It's just another empty signifier in the whole simulated reality or what have you.
Yeah, and as we're learning more and more about archaeology and the quote unquote origins of Homo sapiens, we are learning more and more that humans don't come from just one ancestor. There's a whole variety of species that came into both conflict and intimacy to form the species as we know it.
Notably, Neanderthal is the clearest example of that.
Definitely, I mean, that's definitely part of it, but it's not the only part, right? There's all the, I haven't kept track of them, but scientists more and more. Now, what's interesting is for those scientists, they are using DNA in a certain way that I think is not necessarily mythological, right? Because they are using it in a way that is involving statistics and obviously the scientific method and these other ways.
Which Baudrillard also discusses here.
Sure. Yeah.
Relative to statistics.
No. I just think here in the relation to the question of genetic man, it's very easy to see how the resurgent focus on it is also, to use a Baudrillardian term, an alibi for these ugly things that we've been talking about, like eugenics, like race science, like new modes of supremacy.
Okay, so he was referencing statistics. I already actually read the.
Oh yeah. That's right. I think that though. Well, that's in the sense of political science and in the sense of our representative democracies. I think that's perhaps a little bit different. Obviously, statistics isn't just one thing. I meant more of a outside of the frame of the question answer kind of stock response. Because what Deleuze would say, and I think Baudrillard would agree. When Baudrillard is talking about the sort of answer being sort of pre-existing with the question inherent in it, and we're We're kind of like the way that we take fucking tests nowadays, right? Which is about rote memorization and regurgitation, meeting quote unquote standard criteria of subjects that we're supposed to memorize. That kind of shit, Baudrillard's totally on point. And what Deleuze will even say is about the fact that real freedom and also real intellectual progress comes with the power to determine problems, to determine the questions.
Yes.
And so if all the questions are already pre-made, that also means that all the answers are already presupposed.
Yeah.
And that's what Baudrillard is warning us about. Whereas I think that, for Deleuze, it's not necessarily as pessimistic, or he's not emphasizing, in a certain sense, Deleuze, you can read him pessimistically, but I think that his tone and tenor, he wants us to read him as trying to already assume some of this pessimism that Baudrillard's hitting us over the head with and say, okay, now what then, how then can we turn that on its head? I wonder if Baudrillard's background, as we talked about with Roland Barthes, so sign analysis, with Henri Lefebvre, so analysis of everyday life, like fashion, which is what we just talked about. If part of that negativity that sometimes comes out with him is a part of the sociological background, and that difference is perhaps why Deleuze and Baudrillard are so close, yet very, very different, because that sociological interest for Deleuze was never a specialty. Right. It was always kind of another discourse with which, it was like another discourse with which to dialogue. Whereas Baudrillard is, I think that sometimes he's discussed as a sociologist first, rather than a philosopher.
Or theorist,
Exactly. So this is perhaps why I also get frustrated with him, is because I want to read him as a philosopher, and he's not willing to make that distinction.
I think as well that he's less hostile to Hegel than Deleuze. And though I would say, is it fair to say Deleuze is anti-Hegel? At least on a certain level, right? Like on a certain.
But also he knows very well that you can't oppose Hegel. You can't be anti-Hegel, because then you're alpha bunged right into you're playing on his own fucking terrain. This is
waiting for us.
This is why he crafts, in opposition to contradiction, the notion of vice diction, because his point being that opposites is not the extreme form of difference, which I always take as a way of going around Hegel. I mean, you kind of have to go through Hegel, though, to go around him. I think that's just, no matter what, you're gonna, but you can't oppose him. So anyway, I agree with what you said.
I would say that Hegel through Lacan, because obviously he's taking a little bit more of a Lacanian position, though not entirely. Like Freud is certainly a huge touchstone. The touchstones are the same, right? Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, for both thinkers, right? But it's almost they're on opposite sides of this dialectic.
I wonder if part of the difference too, since we keep talking about the trilogy, post-68 French trilogy, Anti-Oedipus, Libidinal Economy, and Symbolic, Exchange and Death, I wonder if with Baudrillard, if one of the differences is, instead of Freud, Marx, Nietzsche, it's Freud, Marx, Mauss, if that inflects it a little bit differently. We'll come back to that when we discuss chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus. As an excursus, because I want to look at his discussion of Freud in this chapter in the transference. But before that, do you have that? You have that, right? You have that.
Yes.
Okay, so before we get to that, I wanted to discuss, we talked about this maybe in the Wicked Leotard stuff, but do you remember us discussing John Baudrillard kind of pissing everybody off?
Yes.
Do you have it? Can you restate the anecdote? Baudrillard kind of got kicked out of every group he ever belonged to. Is there something to this?
Yes, there's a apocryphal story.
Okay.
It may even be documented, but there's a story about a reading group that was started, and it was Deleuze, Guattari, Baudrillard, Leotard. I forget who else. I may even Google this just to see if anything...
Maybe Foucault, maybe not.
Oh, okay, here it is.
You mean to read this?
Sure.
On one account, the occasion of the polemic against Foucault was the proposed formation of a study group consisting of Baudrillard, Foucault, Lyotard, Deleuze, Guattari, and others, for which Baudrillard presented a position paper. And there's a footnote, but Baudrillard's polemic was so aggressive and its critique of his French contemporary so extreme that after a heated debate, the group disbanded. So yeah, he kind of pissed some people off.
The book that's from is Jean Baudrillard, From Marxism to Postmodernism and Beyond by Douglas Kellner.
If I remember correctly, in the intro, the editors of the work of Symbolic Exchange and Death kind of say that perhaps Kellner was a little negative against Baudrillard in this book.
He was.
But funnily enough, Kellner has the blurb on the back of my copy of the book. This is easily Baudrillard's most important work. So. But you pulled up the quote. So that after that juicy bit of gossip, which is honestly why
always fun to make those connections too. I think that the intersecting lives, to borrow the title of the Deleuze and Guattari book, this milieu of thinkers is that their interactions to me are, I don't know, it's just really fun to read about that kind of stuff. I enjoy it a lot.
It brings it also some of the gossip keeps it real, keeps it from being all this super hyper serious shit, it reminds us that they were real people with real desires and real conflicts, and they could be catty and bitchy, and they could throw shade. Apparently Baudrillard threw some shade. I have the quote pulled up too, but I'm just going to look at the footnote before you start. I'll let you read this one. Let me look at the footnote. What do you got? Oh, that's the one footnote that's like a page and a half long.
Right.
Oh, fuck. We aren't going to look at that. But if we had enough time, we could spend a lot of time on it, because he does talk about simulated Oedipus and stuff like that. So maybe we could come back to that footnote when we go back to anti-Oedipus. But I'll let you read this quote.
As to how those polled respond to the pollsters, how natives respond to ethnologists, the analysand to the analyst, you may be sure that there is a total circularity in every case. Those questions always behave as the questioner imagines they will and solicits them to. Even the psychoanalytic transference and countertransference collapses today under the shock of this simulated and anticipated response, which is simply a modality of the self-fulfilling prophecy. So we come up against the strained paradox where whatever those polled, analysands, and natives say, it is irredeemably short-circuited and lost. Indeed, it is on the basis of this foreclosure that these disciplines, sociology, psychoanalysis, and ethnology, will be able to develop in leaps and bounds. Such amazing developments is just hot air. However, since the circular response of those polled, the analysands, and the natives is nevertheless a challenge and a victorious revenge, when they turn the question back on itself, isolating it by holding the expected mirror image response up to it, then there is no hope that the question can ever get out of what is in the vicious circle of power. And then it goes on. It is exactly the systems of advanced democracies become stable through. Okay, that's going too far. The vicious circle of power.
The end of the paragraph is just another sentence or two away. That is why the controlled responses of the dominated are nevertheless somehow a genuine response, a desperate vengeance which lets power bury power. But it does come back to this question about fundamentally who gets to ask the questions, how those questions are posed. That's real freedom. That's real power.
Right. Yeah.
And Deleuze's
that great.
Deleuze's drawing on some of what Spinoza discusses, some of what even Nietzsche discusses, particularly Spinoza and the emendation of the intellect and this notion about improving our understanding, our intellect for bettering the general welfare, which one could see in the general understanding an idealistic way of thinking, but there has to be a little bit of idealism, not in the sense of materialism, but a sense of like optimism in a
possibility.
And being able to increase one's power and thereby increase collectively the power of the collectivity of communities. I mean, unless you're a nihilist, right? Which is really, rereading Libidinal Economy, I keep thinking about one of Lyotard's assumptions about Baudrillard and what he was doing in the 60s and 70s is this accusation of a kind of nihilism. I think he's including Baudrillard in that. And a nihilism in this, and still wanting to wager on the true. Now, what's interesting reading Symbolic Exchange of Death was obviously comes 2 years later after Lyotard's, I would say, loving but biting criticisms of Baudrillard. He seems to have now incorporated the critique. And so you see that in the stages, in the orders of simulacrum, the true also has been for Baudrillard. I think he's gotten past that. Yeah. Would you agree somewhat?
I think so. If not here, then definitely later on in his work, he does to a degree. But I don't know that there's always that charge of this lost object or this lost origin being like kind of one of Baudrillard's more reactionary positions.
Well, here he at least is acknowledging that the search for the lost origin is mythological. One could still question whether or not he believes that or not, but that's unanswerable. That's undecidable. One would have to have a certain amount of bad faith if one were to impute it to him directly. Mm-hmm. But if one were to go further and try to contextualize at least the earlier statements and juxtapose them, you could at least get something productive out of it without being in bad faith.
Yeah.
I don't have the time or inclination to do some of that, but
he does, I feel like, have the ethos that you can't mourn the lost real. And that later on he says in the book as well that trying to fight capitalism on the level of the real is a losing battle.
That's interesting.
He wants to take that terrain and move that to the symbolic.
Right.
And that's where the whole excursus into graffiti at the urban level.
Yeah.
Because he gives it this kind of, it seems quaint now, but it is and it isn't, in the sense of, like you said, there are now designated areas for simulation of graffiti.
At least in that one example he gave of, he even named the wall of it, but go on. Go ahead.
But I mean, even so, Austin had a place called Castle Hill, which was a graffiti park that got moved or whatever. So there is still this, if there's no threat to capital by graffiti, in the sense, there is still there is a move by the state or whomever to remove graffiti.
Right.
It is something that is aggressively, maybe not as aggressively as it was at one time, stopped. But if you notice, it's definitely not something that, it's only in a certain context, graffiti is allowed to be considered a cultural object. One of the biggest ones was here in Austin was the frog that I forget the Austin frog mural. Hi, how are you? Was this frog. Okay.
Isn't that the, never mind. Go ahead.
So this was actually, I think they ended up moving it from its original thing, right? Because now it's got its whole special place, right? But I want to say it was Daniel
Johnston.
Daniel Johnston. Yeah, it was a Daniel Johnston thing.
That's what I was about to say. I was like, isn't that it was very influential for 90s
like DIY
rock
music, right?
Yeah, I mean, I remember Kurt Cobain. There's a famous picture of him wearing the shirt, the Hi, How Are You shirt, and there's a good documentary about Daniel Johnston.
Yeah. So, but it's still, and I was thinking about this too in the film Demolition Man. They have, in the future of Demolition Man, they have automatic defenses against graffiti. People come and tag this little thing, lasers come up and they like clean the surface of the building. So there is this kind of inscription, this writing, whatever property value is a big concern relative to graffiti, right? Because there's connotations of class, racial and class connotations relative to areas where graffiti persists. It's this ever vigilant game that's played, cat and mouse, between the graffiti artist and the state, or whomever, that is trying to keep the surfaces right, which is really interesting. Like, it seems on its face, it's kind of a quaint notion that graffiti has this power, and it's sort of, and it's like a memeability almost.
Yeah, I mean, he's basically saying the McLuhan thing, that the medium itself is the message, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's just names, or that the message is zero, right?
Yeah.
So that's
because they don't give their proper names; they have an alias,
right?
They use whenever they tag,
which does nicely tie the loop between counterfeiting, say, a Picasso or a Rembrandt, whether through virtuosity of skill and faking a signature, to the signatures themselves being quote unquote faked or pseudonyms.
Right.
And the artistry not being about recreating or fooling anyone that it's some great lost work of art.
Wait till you see how I'm going to quilt this shit together. You're going to love this. As part of my research for this chapter, I watched 2 films, the first of which was F is for Fake, which was released in 1972 in France. Orson Welles directed and stars in the film. The film is primarily concerned with this seeming, it's a sort of a fake documentary, with fake being in sort of scary quotes. And it's a fake documentary about a fake art forger. So it's all going about this certain famous art forger who was able to persist for decades or whatever, and would do these forgeries of famous paintings and then sell them to art museum directors, art markets. He would sell these to, and part of the film is this other gentleman that wrote a book about the fake art forger. And as part of his book, what he discovers when talking to the forger, when talking to the art people, the art experts, is that invariably they would all find something to say, oh, you can see within the lines here, this is so-and-so's trademark, blah, blah, blah. So every museum director that he goes to discuss these fakes are sort of they're making up the reasons why this is an authentic piece or something like that is maybe the way to describe it. So the role of the expert is this tautology. It's a tautology in the same way that the polls are a tautology.
Right.
And it is only the experts, the punditocracy. Mm-hmm. The punditocracy and the museum directors, the art market, the people that are involved in this have a similar function in that they create this sort of tautology of these, what are perceived, what are sold as real data on the level of the poll or an original or real piece of art by a certain artist. It's all smoke and mirrors. There's no substance to it. It's tautology. I'm an expert, so I can give value to this work of art that is a fake, that is not real, the same way that polls can give credence to public opinion, but are really, their logic is to manufacture public opinion.
This reminds me of why we should at some point watch Zizek's Pervert's Guide to Cinema, because I can't help but, after listening to you describe the narrative of F is for Fake, just to bring it back to the fucking Matrix again, where Zizek is, in my head, famously like discussing the red pill versus the blue pill. And I need a third pill, right? I need the third pill because, if the red pill is reality and the blue pill is illusion or simulation, right? Where it's like the third pill would be seeing the illusion in reality or vice versa. However you want to put it. This is why also I said we have to read Nietzsche's Twilight Idols, his discussion of how the real world, became an illusion, or the true world, became an illusion. Very much kind of vibing with everything we said. One thing that I think, again, kind of shows Baudrillard's pessimism is by discussing the stock response answer as the standard and falling into this notion whereby the transference and counter-transference are short-circuited, which is another concept that Zizek's very keen on. I feel like there's a wild, almost delirious, I don't know if it's an optimism in Lyotard when he discusses how transference and counter-transference is all around us. It's constantly happening. And I think that Deleuze and Guattari would agree with a kind of statement like that it's happening behind our backs. It's not just in the analyst-analysand relationship or in the native ethnographer relationship, right? It's all around us. It's constantly happening. And one could even say it's even happening more collectively than individually necessarily. But even in our individual lives, even when you and I face to face and I take on your faciality traits. I take on some of your mannerisms, your way of speaking, that kind of stuff. It's not necessarily imitation. It's not even simulation, right? It's not even like conscious. It's
right. It's the machinic unconscious.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's just that's little bits and fragments of speech and this is where I think that like Guattari would push back on this sort of omnipotence of the binary code that Baudrillard is trying to scare us with when Guattari is trying to disrupt the kind of semiological supremacy, the universal semiotics or the universal semiology, I think is what the metallurgy is semiurgy that Baudrillard is preaching here. I think, and I do think preaching is a good word for it, because Lyotard might say, like, isn't all of this still like too pious?
Yeah.
This stuff about, and this is also why, even if he's like, there's no lost origins, somehow Baudrillard feels nostalgic, even if he's arguing against it.
Yeah, that makes sense. He does have a certain Zarathustrian vibe to him, I think.
I've come down from the mountain and I have seen the code in person. Yeah, it's, again, maybe I'm being uncharitable. I'm always willing to say that. It's good to kind of be aware of when bad faith kind of creeps in.
The question for me would be, does it matter in a sense, right? Because I feel like there's this notion of the hyperreality it seems to be clearly working, or society, whatever, seems to be moving like this, almost to a T. In the real world that we inhabit, or in the world that we inhabit, what Baudrillard is saying is it seems undeniably correct to me. I can go into that, but if you have a rebuttal.
No, we're not going to fucking debate on this.
Not a debate, but you know what I mean. A response.
Riposte. I guess I would say two things. One, I'm still eager to see how it all works. I know when I say how it all works, not necessarily the orders of simulacra, blah, blah, blah. What I mean is like how what he's gearing us up for gets us ready for, I assume the biggest chapter is the symbolic, the death chapter.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that because we still haven't necessarily gotten to what the book is quote unquote doing. We're still getting kind of prepped. We're getting lubed up, a little foreplay, the only thing I would say about does it matter, and I think that you meant does it matter that he has, well, I would say I'm trying to vibe with him and he's making me cringe a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's an unquantifiable, unqualifiable like feeling. So I don't know. Sometimes Baudrillard just gives me bad vibes. Like it's a bad trip, man. I don't know. Bad weed.
Oh, the medicine is, yeah. I mean, it's a bitter pill. He is right, but I feel like
you're totally right. You're totally right. I got to fucking put on my big boy pants and stop whining.
Just thinking about the way that he indicates that, or like draws this comparison, or that illustrated with the way that polls and public opinion are shaped. Manufacturing consent, whatever. Like,
yeah,
this is not necessarily a new insight exactly, other than interrogating what that means beyond a level of propaganda and a simple model of sender receiver and all of that feedback response loops, etc.
Right.
Those models are obviously inadequate to describe because they don't have a model of the unconscious that works very sophisticatedly. That would be evinced by the world itself. But I think looking at something, as recent as the January 6th thing, I mean, that is one of the most hyper-real non-events that's ever not taken place.
Baudrillard totally would have written a 10-page book on January 6th.
Because it's like the Truman Show, but not you know what I mean? It's not literally the Truman Show, and the fact that Truman was fooled into living in this world, but it's the Truman Show in the sense that the world is produced.
And surprisingly, so many of them had their own fucking cell phones out, taking selfies and live broadcasting it, right?
Exactly right. Further simulating the whole thing. But what happened when they got there is that the emperor has no clothes. The signification of the capital, the power, the seat of power, and then they go there and it's an empty
Well, it's dog fucking catches car.
Exactly.
It's
So that's how simulation operates, right? It's like this, the whole motive of the rebellion is fake. The rebellion is fake. The power is fake. Everything is fake. It's all just bullshit, you know what I mean?
Which is very, very in line with Trump's modus operandi. Right?
Yeah, it's the whole scopophilic, the flattening of everything to the screen, really. Flattening and general equivalence. Everything is this flattened surface, this 2D surface. There's no depth. Thinking of the quote from, it's like My Cousin Vinny. Remember when he goes to meet with the two youths and they're in the jail cell and he pulls out a card. He says, the prosecutor is going to show you this card. He's going to show you to it in a very special way. He's going to show you that it's got sides. He's going to show you that it's got a front. But what he's not going to show you is that it's thin as this deck of card or this card or whatever, right?
Yeah, right.
And it's the same fucking thing. Come attack the place of power, and then when you get there, it's revealed to be empty.
Yeah, and I always wonder, like, if they would have gotten their hands on Pence, would they have?
Yeah, right.
Would they have taken him hostage? Would they have lynched him? Would they have torn him limb from limb? Would they have forced him under, mortal threat to do the thing that they were hoping he would do, which was not verify, the changing of the guard, blah, 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 which wasn't really within his constitutional power, but it was something that was kind of a part of the conspiracy theory that somehow Pence could, falsify the election or not verify it. How are you going to put it?
The funniest thing is the whole notion that the election was stolen. It's always already been stolen in a sense. Always already.
There was
through public opinion polls, etc. The whole simulated element of the two-party monopoly, the dialectic that the two drives that sort of prop one another up.
You're setting us up for the next discussion. I see where you're going. I will say real quickly, since we're on this topic and we can move on to the Twin Towers, one of my favorite teachers, Sid Littlefield, he's on Twitter, but I won't give his name out because he's kind of covert. He discussed how the thing that Al Gore did wrong was when the court passed their unprecedented and unprecedentable decision that Bush wins and the count stops, that Al Gore didn't take to the streets. That's when shit would get real. So that would be kind of transgressing, one could say it gets on the real by way of symbolic transgression. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah.
If we're going to stick with the Baudrillardian logic,
right.
Because then that breaks down the grip of, and it wouldn't be, hey, let's put out a poll and see if, taken to the streets would, well, how do y'all feel about that? It couldn't go through this question response medium that Baudrillard is discussing is already part and parcel of the system. It would have to be, and in that sense, to a certain extent, it would mirror what January 6th was meant to do, even if it had different objectives or had different means of doing it. And even if it didn't necessarily end in physical violence, the symbolic violence would have been similar and perhaps more successful. Who knows, right? Because that's a counterfactual.
Right.
What if Al Gore would have...
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's one of the biggest linchpins of history in our lifetimes is that election.
In a way, it's like, again, we're going to move on to the question of the Twin Towers. You know what's funny? What I was thinking about when I was reading about Baudrillard's discussion, and I'm going to let you fill us in, was that in Rome, the most unstable form of government was a duopoly. You needed a triumvirate. And yet we see that, the triumvirate tended to collapse into a monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
Right? At some point, in the trio, things break down. This reminds me too of Eve said.
I mean, it's like, when it's the oldest thing in the book, it's whenever you get three friends together, three guys together, two friends are going to gang up on the other.
Sometimes I mean, in what's interesting in Between Men, Eve Sedgwick's looking at how in English literature or whatever, but you can see this dynamics in real life, how woman is this mediating object for homosociality, right? A way of diffusing the homosexual tension, drive. And that on the flip side, when the man is the mediating object for two women, what tends to happen is the man gets cut out and you collapse into a kind of lesbianism. And I think that that's potentially culturally the fact that somehow feminine bisexuality has always been a little bit more,
right,
quote unquote, natural.
It hasn't been prohibited so much, so violently.
But anyway, let's get to one of the most famous parts of this chapter.
Well, first I want to read this since I was talking about the political elements. He says, voting has become absolutely aleatory. When democracy reaches a formally advanced stage, it is distributed in equal quantities, 50-50. Voting merges with the Brownian motion of particles or probability calculus, as if the whole world were voting according to chance, as if signs were voting themselves. This is you see this in the sense that it's always the swing states that are, and it said, okay, your vote counts more or less depending on where you are in terms of these states, right? If you're in a battleground state, then your vote is more influential than someone in a state like, the kind of Texas, the bulwarks of both parties would be like, California Democrats, Texas Republicans, at least as it stands now.
Texas is leaning more purple. Georgia went fucking for Democrats. And I think that we're going to see more of that with Atlanta being more liberal.
And that is also what's happening with all the California people that are moving to Austin, especially over the pandemic. That's been a pretty clear exodus.
I assume Austin has a lower cost of living than most of
those. Yeah. I mean, for sure. Yeah. But relative to the rest of Texas, Austin is by far the most expensive. Real estate.
Fucking liberals.
Just to like give that out. So a lot of people make the argument that it's like every vote counts. They use these battleground states to say that you should vote because every vote counts.
Right.
When it's the opposite. If the race is so tight that it depends on one single vote, then your vote is worthless.
I think every vote counts only makes sense collectively rather than individually. And I know that's counterintuitive, right. But this notion, every vote counts, is this way of hyping oneself up.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And hyping up the collective.
And hyping up voting, the voting machine or whatever the fuck, the public opinion, blah, blah, blah.
I don't know if in France this was true in 1976 when he wrote this, but aren't there some countries like in Australia where fucking voting participation is mandatory and and otherwise it's punishable by maybe fines or something that?
That is true, yes.
Which wouldn't work in America given just our libertarian streak and all that shit. If you can't mandate fucking vaccines and masks and you can't mandate health insurance, then there's no way you're going to mandate voting. You'd fucking protest that shit.
Here's another quote that gets on the same thing. He says, at this point, it matters little what the parties in power express historically and socially. It is even necessary that they no longer represent anything. Mm-hmm. The fascination of the game and the polls, the formal and statistical compulsion is so much greater.
What's the fucking guy on MSNBC that's like loved election races for so long? Steve Kornacki?
Yeah.
Is that his name?
Yeah, that's the guy, I think.
He's like a fucking sports commentator, when it comes to like elections, especially like presidential elections. He's going to fucking go out there for 12 hours straight and deliriously like, break down the polls and the exit polls and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he makes it exciting, but it's just interesting. It's like, I've loved this shit since I was a little kid. And it's like, fuck, all right. Some people different strokes for different folks. That's kind of kinky, man. But
who's the other guy the Twitter guy that he?
You mean the pollster?
He got notable.
Silver?
Yeah, Nate Silver.
His
shit is really in this simulacra fucking total self
and mostly accurate. I mean, at least in terms of what? At least in terms of the
Nate
presidential.
Silver?
Yeah, I mean, his predictions are based on the polling and or just his refining polls even further than.
I mean, it's under the guise of that, but it's just more simulated bullshit.
I mean, the stuff that he says is sometimes cringe. I wasn't even talking about him as a person. I was talking about the apparatus that he set up was very, very accurate, much more so than many other attempts at predicting outcomes had been. He had like one successvote thing, and the rest of his career has been less accurate.
And now he's considered a scion of voting and blah blah blah, and he's a fucking idiot.
Elon Musk of democracy.
Precisely. Exactly. Yes. Exactly. In the way that
we do a little trolling.
He's a simulated billionaire.
Yeah. Grew up with emeralds in his.
I mean, Trump is the simulacrum par excellence.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And
a fake businessman.
Perhaps that's part of his
sells
allure.
Only his name. Yeah. There's a certain. Well, I think to me, I've had this idea. I've said this many times that in America, it's not the entrepreneur that is the cultural icon. The cultural icon for America really is the huckster. There is a certain anti-elitist ethos to the U.S. And so,
of course,
the fact that they can sort of swindle you, they can swindle the smarter person, kind of the old European model of the person, right? The fact that they can swindle you, even if you're a smart person, and they can trick you into buying their fucking snake oil. That person, the P.T. Barnum and Trump are sort of have that same shared legacy, I think.
Well, I mean, this is exactly what Deleuze and Guattari talk about Oedipus when they're like, look, psychoanalysis didn't invent Oedipus or introduce it. People come to analysts wanting more Oedipus, wanting to be fed the snake oil.
Yeah, right.
wanting to be reassured and in their Oedipal confines. So yeah, I think you're right about that tendency to to want to continue to be.
You don't want the
denial.
It's like they say in that movie, The Prestige. You don't want to know. You want to be fooled. Yes, the desire to be fooled. The whole thing was Michael Caine giving the example of I forget the first. There's 3 parts to the trick, the magic trick. One is the pledge, the turn, and then I guess bringing it back is the final, is the denouement of that. And it's not enough to make something disappear. You have to bring it back.
Right.
If you just made something disappear, people wouldn't know what had happened. Like they wouldn't have a reference point but whenever you bring it back, it gives them that reference point. Oh, okay, that's a trick. The trick is not to make something disappear. The trick is to reproduce it in the duplicate, in the series. And you can see that series idea applied with both Borden and Angier's character in The Prestige, notably Angier, who reproduces himself over and over and over again every night. We never know, and it's never confirmed, did the original Angier drown in the water tank, or was it one of the copies, or does it even matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why Baudrillard later moves away from simulation, or at least emphasizing it, to the notion of disappearance, precisely based on the logic of what you laid out. Because it's the fact that, and to put a Lacanian spin on it, it's not necessarily that we've lost the reference point or the origin, it's that we never had it. Right. There, and Derrida's got on this shit too about his, like in his reading of Rousseau.
Yeah.
Because in Rousseau, there is always this kind of paranoia that the longing for the lost origin or the noble savage and this other stuff, that it's merely a fiction, and it's merely like almost a necessary fiction with which the mind has to
bootstrap itself, sort of.
Yeah, right.
But I mean, just you did mention the World Trade Center and the two towers. Obviously, Baudrillard has a certain fascination with them, and kind of the same context of the double, the duplicate, and how they're sort of just these mirrored surfaces, and they are squares, and so they even sort of represent this sort of statistical, like a bar graph, like two competing side-by-side bar graphs or charts, etc.
Why are there two towers, right? Yeah, I love that question.
Yeah, which I'm less interested in, I think, relative to the remainder of the book, and it's been a while since I read, but I think what Baudrillard does in the end, going back to Mouse, etc., gift and counter gift, and I think there's something to do with the way that the logic of terrorism operates. And so the fact that the terrorist can will give up their death, and there's no gift that capitalism can give back. And so terrorism is something that capitalism struggles or cannot, at least, can't remember how definitive he gets his logic about. But this is seen as a potential area where capitalism is sort of powerless against the terrorists because they don't value their life. They're willing to part with their life and shut off the exchange circuit, the symbolic exchange or something like that.
And we see what America tried to reciprocate with, which was fucking imperialism. And that's a hot topic, obviously, for, contemporary reasons, pulling out of Afghanistan after basically 20 years. And we could have easily looked at history, say what the Soviet Union tried to do, what the Brits tried to do. You can't. Afghanistan is not going to yield.
It wasn't quite. Isn't Afghanistan where Alexander the Great's whole campaign stalled, or was that further?
I thought that he stalled.
It was closer to India, I thought.
Yeah, I thought. Yeah, Alexander wept for he had no more worlds to conquer. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I assume you're discussing the spirit of terrorism.
Well, he also
discusses this in the agony of power as well. He discusses this some.
I think in the death chapter, we'll get more into this logic, but I'm just
even in chapter one,
remembered things.
Even in chapter 1, he discusses terrorism a little bit in this notion of taking hostages and this notion of only my immediate death can symbolically disrupt, short circuit the system. It's like, goddamn.
Shoot the hostage. Remember in what was it? Speed? Quiz hot shot. What do you do, hot shot? Shoot the hostage.
I mean, it's funny. I know it's a cultural icon. I've never seen Speed.
I don't think I've seen all of it. Cancel maybe. I feel like there's a Austin Powers where they're like, there is no world anymore. It's all corporations. I think maybe it's the first one or the second one. Robert Wagner, like number 2.
Yeah.
Because he pulls the gun on Dr. Evil and he's like, you don't understand. Like there is no world anymore.
That's interesting.
But yet Dr. Evil's from this previous paradigm where like that does, you know what I mean? So I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Evil's terrorism and extortion versus the Joker's.
Yeah, remember the funny thing too, like one of the jokes is he asked for $1 million.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
I could discuss a little bit about Synecdoche, New York, the film, the Charlie Kaufman film, where kind of similar to the Borges story that he starts this stage play and the set begins to take over reality. Eventually there's a set within a set within a set. And the set is beginning to resemble, the set is so elaborate, it begins to resemble the real world and distinguishing between that. And there's all these duplicate characters that show up in the film. I don't know. It's a good film to look at if you want to kind of get an example of what Baudrillard is speaking of. He even mentions there's a line of dialogue in the film, and I DM'd you the picture that Philip Seymour Hoffman's character even says, I thought about calling the play Simulacrum. which is super interesting. And then there's all these visual jokes of where there's two versions of his character and there's two versions of another character, and they're doing like the same mannerisms. And it's pure, this hyper reality. It's hilariously funny in the way that it plays out.
Definitely have to catch up and watch the two movies.
F is for Fake has its own one kind of, and I may be misunderstanding McLuhan to some degree, but one kind of interesting element of F is for Fake is how much the editing signifies, or not, I would know. It's not that the editing necessarily signifies, but I feel like the editing of the film being so, for one thing, it's an incredible achievement in film editing. Just as someone who kind of pays attention to those things, it's incredibly done. And the editing really makes the movie, in the sense of the medium is the message, almost was kind of what I was thinking as far as F is for Fake goes. But it also gets at this notion of an original, a fake, a copy, etc. And those questions. And then it even becomes this own hyper-real retrospective on Wells' own film career, because he brings on discussions within F is for Fake of course, the famous War of the Worlds radio thing that was a fake, wasn't real. It was a dramatized version of H.G. Wells. There's a certain irony there, right? In terms of difference in repetition of Wells, H.G. Wells, W-E-L-L-S, and Orson Welles, W-E-L-L-E-S, right? And dramatizing that story, that novel, and that having these producing real effects out in the world where people thought an actual alien invasion was occurring.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. It's hard to put oneself in the mindset of those listening.
Yeah.
Right. It's hard to think about that today with just the rise of conspiracy theories and YouTube channels devoted to fucking aliens are everywhere. The people in power are reptiles and baby killers and shit. I mean, like all of it, we're inundated in that.
I mean, Q, right? What is Q but total simulated, some type of simulated political economy narrative thing? I don't even know, but I feel like Baudrillard understood. He anticipated the logic of QAnon, and he anticipated the logic of the 9/11 hijackers.
I think that the one thing Baudrillard would say about Q, though, is that the followers are always saying, okay, there is a legitimate referential. It's just about finding the right code to decrypt it.
Right.
And so he would say, but that's how it functions.
That's the simulated.
It hooks them into saying there's a meaning.
Right.
And I think that for Baudrillard, that's both its strength, but also shows its pure effervescence or evanescence. It's pure just bullshit, and shows how the conspiracy theorist mind frame is that everything can be decrypted and point to a bigger conspiracy, even by showing that the conspiracy is fake or fabricated, it's just another layer to the conspiracy.
Yes.
Of course, that's what they want you to think. That type of mindset, you see this too in like,
it's easier to accept that there's a conspiracy than to accept that no one is in charge and no one knows what the fuck they're doing. It's a comforting narrative.
It's much, you're right. It's much easier to think of this big other that's
there a
evil
person
and outside.
There's an actual other that you can point your finger at, and when we're all complicit.
I mean, this is the same logic as of anti-Semitism. It's much easier to pin it down on one spooky other that's controlling everything and behind the scenes. There's something, but that's also a theological reinforcement.
Yeah.
Right. That God is behind the scenes. And so therefore in worldly powers, there has to be a summit of all power that can be given a face to.
Yes. And a name.
Yeah. And a name and therefore be a target of combat.
Yeah.
Oh, I say combat, you know what I mean? Be a target for extermination potentially, right? That's another dangerous side to that kind of thinking.
This simulated shit also applies to these constant. You see this a lot. I mean, Portland is ground zero for the conflict between like Proud Boys and quote unquote Antifa, etc., or these like militia type movements. So it's these people out on this. Yesterday, someone was stabbed in L.A. by a Proud Boy, and yeah, so it's just this fucking idiots are out pretending to LARPing revolution,
right?
Without changing a thing. It's like, okay, here, do you want to get out? You want to play your little game? Yeah, capitalism can incorporate that too. You know, you want to have your little signifier, your little MAGA hat. The good thing about Antifa is all black clad does something different than the whole MAGA, the patriotic.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that they are more aptly described as counter-revolutionaries, right? Because they want to roll the clock back. That's why I Make America Great Again. The nostalgic hook of there is this lost utopic thing that if we just reinstate older mentalities, reactionary views, reverse progress, re-hierarchize society, if we patriarchize,
if we re-encode the flows of desire, then everything will be fine. With an earlier body without organs. That's what Deleuze and Guattari will start talking about in the coming pages. This notion of reinvesting or resuscitating or resurrecting an old body without organs, an old socius, an older one, which in fact is too also mythological or fictional, but it could still have effects. That's what we learned from Baudrillard and Deleuze and Guattari, is this notion that the fictional isn't necessarily opposed to the real, that the fictional has real effects, and therefore fictions can be very fucking powerful. My last comment would be just, you mentioned body without organs, so I just wanted to go back and point out that Baudrillard, in a discussion of the graffiti artist, did say that he kind of did draw this equivalence.
That's right.
Describe the city as a body without organs. So just to mention that kind of briefly.
I tried to track that down in the books where he discusses body without organs. He mentions it once or twice in Logic of Sense, but that's related to Artaud because it's Artaud's coinage. I looked at Anti-Oedipus. I looked at 1,000 Plateaus. I didn't see it, but I assume it was something co-written with Guattari. So the fact that Baudrillard attributes it only to Deleuze is like, oh, come on, buddy. It does make sense with his discussion of graffiti and the notion of exporting the ghettoification of the white suburbs. I mean, the closest analogy I could think of would be with Deleuze and Guattari talking about Oedipus being part and parcel with the of the mass imposition of colonialism and its logic. So exporting colonialism or importing it, if you want to put it that way, which again, they'll discuss more in chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus.
The next chapter is chapter 3 for this book is Fashion or the Enchanting Spectacle of the Code, which will be quite interesting because I do enjoy fashion as well. And I wonder if that discussion of the MAGA hats, the Proud Boy, like they wear the Fred Perry yellow and black shirts, etc. Antifa, typically all predominantly black clad. You might have the anarchy symbol, etc. But typically they eschew. It's like this block. I mean, that's the whole idea of like black bloc is no one can be identified. No individual can be identified by the scopophilic gaze of the panopticon.
When I discuss, protective procedures against COVID with my libertarian friends, I'm like, don't you want to wear masks so that facial recognition technology is scrambled and all this stuff? That's generally the only way I've made some logical headway with them, talking to them about the collective or individual benefits, because it's always my body, blah, blah, blah. But if you bring up the panopticon and foiling, facial recognition technology, they kind of go like, okay, I don't want to be on that grid. That's like the best I've done. I think that for next time we do Baudrillard, we should probably read chapters 3 and 4. Together, they're only about 45 pages.
I'm game for that.
And then I think chapter 5 is long enough. We might want to do it by itself.
that will be our episode of the Machine Ink Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. See y'all next week.
Of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.